In the early hours of April 26, 1986, a nuclear reactor in Soviet Ukraine exploded and changed the history of energy, public health, and government secrecy. Reactor 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, near the city of Pripyat, was destroyed during a late-night safety test. What followed was not a single blast with a contained aftermath, but a chain of fire, radiation release, evacuation, denial, and cleanup that stretched across decades. Chernobyl became the worst nuclear disaster in history, one of only 2 accidents ever rated at the maximum level on the International Nuclear Event Scale, alongside Fukushima in 2011. But to understand why it became so catastrophic, we have to look beyond the explosion itself. Chernobyl was built as part of the Soviet Union's push for large-scale nuclear power. The nearby city of Pripyat was created to house workers and their families, a modern city built around the promise of technological progress. Reactor 4 was one of several operating units at the plant, and on paper it represented industrial confidence, massive output, centralized planning, and nuclear engineering at national scale. But beneath that image were risks that were not fully understood by the operators on duty. The reactor design had dangerous characteristics, and the safety culture around it was shaped by hierarchy, pressure, and secrecy. Those factors mattered as much as any single technical failure. The disaster began with a test. Operators wanted to simulate what would happen if the reactor lost outside electrical power during a serious accident. Even after a shutdown, a reactor still needs cooling, and the test was meant to see whether the spinning turbines could briefly provide enough electricity to keep coolant pumps running until backup generators came online. In principle, this was a safety experiment. In practice, it was performed under unstable conditions after an accidental drop in reactor power. The reactor was not behaving as intended, and instead of stopping the test completely, the team continued while trying to bring the reactor back into the required range. That low power state was dangerous because of the reactor's behavior and design. The Chernobyl reactor type had characteristics that could make it unstable under certain conditions, especially when power levels were low and operators were trying to control the reaction manually. Control rods, which were supposed to slow the nuclear reaction, had a design flaw that could initially increase reactivity when inserted under specific circumstances. This meant that a shutdown action, intended to make the reactor safer, could briefly make it more powerful. The operators did not fully appreciate how close they were to disaster. When the emergency shutdown was triggered, the reactor's flaws and unstable state combined in the worst possible way. A sudden power surge ripped through Reactor 4. The reactor components ruptured, coolant was lost, and steam explosions tore apart the core and destroyed the reactor building. This was followed by a meltdown and a fire in the exposed reactor core. Unlike an ordinary industrial fire, this fire could loft radioactive material high into the atmosphere, spreading contamination far beyond the plant. 2 engineers were killed in the immediate explosion, and others suffered severe burns and radiation exposure. The physical destruction was enormous, but the invisible danger was even greater. Radioactive particles began moving with the wind across parts of the Soviet Union and Europe. The first response was chaotic and heroic. Firefighters and plant workers rushed toward the damaged reactor, often without fully understanding the radiation levels around them. Their job was to extinguish fires, prevent further spread, and stabilize what remained of the site. Many received extreme radiation doses in a short time. Of the 237 workers who were hospitalized, 134 developed symptoms of acute radiation syndrome, a severe illness caused by high radiation exposure. 28 of them died within 3 months. These early responders were among the people who paid the highest immediate human cost, because they stood closest to the exposed reactor when the danger was at its peak. For the people of Pripyat, the disaster did not immediately arrive as an announcement. It arrived as confusion. The city was only a few kilometers from the plant, yet daily life initially continued under an invisible threat. Radiation cannot be seen or smelled in the way smoke or chemicals can, so many residents had no way to judge the danger. About 36 hours after the accident, the Soviet government established a 10-kilometer exclusion zone and began evacuating around 49,000 people. Residents were told to bring only essential items and expect a temporary absence. Most never returned to live there. Pripyat became a frozen city, abandoned almost overnight. The evacuation zone later expanded to 30 kilometers, forcing approximately 68,000 more people to leave. This created not only a logistical crisis, but a social one. Entire communities were uprooted from homes, schools, farms, and workplaces. The official response was also shaped by secrecy. The Soviet government did not publicly acknowledge the disaster until 2 days after the explosion, and only after elevated radiation levels were detected in Sweden. That detail became one of the defining symbols of Chernobyl, a disaster so large that it could not be contained, yet one that authorities initially failed to explain openly to their own citizens and the wider world. The health impact of Chernobyl is one of the most debated and sensitive parts of the disaster. The immediate fatalities included workers killed in the explosion and emergency responders who died from acute radiation syndrome. Over the next decade, 14 more workers died of various causes, most not directly linked to radiation exposure. The clearest long-term health effect was a rise in childhood thyroid cancer among affected populations, especially where radioactive iodine entered the food supply. By 2005, about 6,000 childhood thyroid cancer cases had occurred in affected populations, with a large fraction attributed to the accident. 15 of those cases were fatal. Estimating the total long-term death toll is difficult because radiation risk is statistical, spread across populations, and influenced by many factors. Different organizations and studies have produced different projections. United Nations estimates have suggested up to 4,000 eventual deaths in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia among the most affected groups, while broader estimates across Europe have reached around 16,000. These numbers are not just a matter of counting bodies after a single event. They reflect complex modeling of cancer risk over time. This uncertainty is part of Chernobyl's legacy. The disaster did not end when the fire was extinguished, because its health consequences unfolded slowly. The cleanup required an enormous mobilization. More than 500,000 personnel were involved in the response, including soldiers, engineers, miners, firefighters, medical teams, construction workers, and so-called liquidators tasked with limiting contamination. The cost was staggering, estimated at 18 billion rubles at the time, and the broader long-term cost has been estimated in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Chernobyl remains one of the most expensive disasters in history. The response was not only about managing a destroyed reactor, but about protecting nearby reactors, decontaminating land, relocating people, monitoring health, and constructing barriers against radiation. By December 1986, crews completed the original Chernobyl sarcophagus, a massive structure built around the destroyed Reactor 4 to reduce the spread of radioactive contamination and provide protection for workers at the remaining units. It was built quickly under extreme conditions, and while it served a vital purpose, it was never meant to be a permanent solution. Decades later, from 2016 to 2018, the new safe confinement was constructed around the old sarcophagus. This huge arch-shaped structure was designed to allow the eventual removal of reactor debris. The cleanup is scheduled to continue until around 2065, nearly 80 years after the explosion. Chernobyl's lesson is not simply that nuclear power is dangerous. It is that complex technology becomes far more dangerous when design flaws, poor communication, unsafe procedures, and political secrecy overlap. A safety test meant to prepare for an emergency instead created one of the worst emergencies ever recorded. Pripyat was abandoned and replaced by the purpose-built city of Slavudik, but the memory of Reactor 4 remains fixed in global history. Chernobyl showed that disasters are rarely caused by one mistake alone. They are built from systems, decisions, assumptions, and delays. And when those systems fail at nuclear scale, the consequences can last for generations. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.